The ring rolled across the saloon floor and landed against the spittoon. There was a half-second of absolute silence, the kind that only happens when every soul in a room sucks in their breath at the same time, and then Fiona Prout laughed. Not a gentle, embarrassed laugh meant to soften the blow. Not a nervous giggle that a man might later convince himself was something other than what it was. She laughed from somewhere deep in her chest, the kind of laugh that fills a room and bounces off the walls and sits down at every table, and every man in the Lucky Star Saloon in Redemption, Texas, turned to watch. Marcus Vane was still on one knee. He had gone down on one knee like he had seen it done somewhere, maybe in a dime novel or in a memory from a life that felt like it belonged to somebody else. And he had held out the ring, a modest thing, hammered silver with a chip of blue turquoise set in the center. And he had said what he meant to say, though the words had come out wrong in the order, tangled up by nerves, missing the parts that mattered most and keeping the parts that mattered least. He had said something about horses and open land, and not being the kind of man to make promises he could not keep. And somewhere in there, he had said her name twice by accident and forgotten to say the word love entirely. And now the ring was against the spittoon and Fiona Prout was laughing. And every cowboy, every drifter, every whiskey-soaked rancher in the Lucky Star was watching Marcus Vane kneel on a dirty floor with his hat in his hand, and his heart out in the open like a wound. The laughter began to die. Fiona pressed her fingers to her lips. Something shifted in her eyes, a shadow crossing whatever amusement had been there, because there was something about the way the man did not move. He did not stand up. He did not flush red and grab his ring and storm out through the swinging doors. He did not look at the floor. He put his other knee down. Both knees on the dirty floorboards of the Lucky Star Saloon, hat still in his hands, eyes still on Fiona Prout, and the room went so quiet that the sound of the wind through the gap under the door was suddenly the loudest thing in the world. "I know that came out wrong," Marcus Vane said, his voice steady in a way that his heart was not. "Most things I say come out wrong, but I meant every single word of it, even the ones in the wrong order, and I will stay right here until you understand that." 6 weeks earlier, Marcus Vane had ridden into Redemption on a horse that had seen better days, carrying nothing but a bedroll, a worn leather saddlebag, and a reputation he had been trying to outrun for 3 years. Redemption was the kind of town that had been named by someone with either tremendous optimism or a dark sense of humor. It sat in the Texas Hill Country in the year 1882, a cluster of buildings along a single main street that the railroad had threatened to reach for 2 years without ever quite managing it. There was the Lucky Star Saloon, a general store run by a man named Horace Gibbs who weighed things twice and charged for it once, a livery stable, a small church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekday mornings, a barber shop, and a land office that had not done much land business since the drought of 1880 had convinced 3 families to pack up and head for greener possibilities. It was not a prosperous town, but it was a town that had held on when others had not, and there was a stubborn pride in the dust of its streets and the lean faces of its people. Marcus rode in on a Tuesday afternoon when the heat was at its worst and the shadows were at their shortest, and the first thing he saw was a woman arguing with a mule. She was standing in the middle of the street, both hands planted on her hips, and the mule, a gray animal of impressive stubbornness, was standing sideways in front of a loaded wagon, refusing with its entire body to take another step. The woman was saying something to it in a low, firm voice, and the mule was expressing its complete indifference to her opinion. Marcus pulled up his horse. He had learned a long time ago that there were 2 kinds of people in the world, The kind who laughed at someone struggling with a mule, and the kind who got off their horse. He got off his horse. "Excuse me," he said, approaching carefully, because mules and angry women both deserved a cautious approach. "You want help with that?" She looked at him. She had dark red hair that was trying to escape from under a wide-brimmed hat, and gray eyes that assessed him the way a person assesses something of uncertain value. She was maybe 26, he thought, with the kind of face that would be beautiful if she were not so obviously irritated. "I have it managed," she said. The mule chose that precise moment to sit down, not stand stubbornly, not balk. Sit down the way a mule will do when it has fully committed to a position and wants you to understand that the discussion is over. The woman stared at it. Marcus kept his face entirely neutral. "I can see that." She looked at him again, and something in his neutrality apparently convinced her that he was not laughing at her, because she exhaled and said, "Fine. His name is Jeremiah. He responds to grain, but I am out of grain, and I am not going back to Gibbs' store because that man charges for the air in the bags." Marcus went to his saddlebag and found the small cloth pouch of oats he kept for his horse after a long ride. He held some out flat-palmed to Jeremiah, who regarded him with ancient, suspicious mule eyes for a long moment, and then stood up and ate them. The woman watched this. "Well," she said, with an expression that suggested she found the universe's timing unreasonable. "Marcus Vane," he said. "Fiona Prout," she said. "I run the boarding house. End of the street, blue shutters. $3 a week includes breakfast." She paused. "You look like you need a place to stay." He probably did. 3 weeks on the trail had a way of making a man look like he needed things. "I might stay a while," he said, which was not quite a commitment, which was the way Marcus Vane said most things in those days. He had been drifting since Abilene. Before Abilene, there had been Dodge City. And before Dodge City, there had been a ranch in New Mexico that he had built from almost nothing over 4 years only to lose it in a way he did not like to think about. The loss had not been entirely his fault, but it had not been entirely someone else's fault either, and the middle ground between those two things was a difficult place to live. The dark past he carried was not the dramatic kind that involved wanted posters or gunfights, though there had been one gunfight that he did not think about if he could help it. His past was the quieter kind of ruin, a business partnership gone wrong because of a man named Edmund Sloan, who had filed a fraudulent deed claim while Marcus was away on a cattle drive, and who had used the letter of a corrupt land law to make the claim stick. By the time Marcus had gotten back to New Mexico, the ranch had a new owner on paper. His foreman had been paid off to testify against him, and the woman he had been quietly planning to ask something important had married Edmund Sloan for the security of it, because she had not known, or had not wanted to know, which amounted to the same thing. He had left New Mexico rather than do something irreversible. That restraint had cost him everything he had built and saved him from everything he might have become, and he was still not entirely sure which side of the ledger it belonged on. Fiona Prout's boarding house had blue shutters and a porch with 2 chairs and a small kitchen garden on the south side. It smelled like biscuits and cedar, and the particular clean air of a house that was kept carefully by someone who had limited resources and high standards. Marcus paid 3 weeks in advance, which made Fiona look at him with that assessing expression again, and he went to his room and slept for 14 hours. In the morning, she put biscuits and gravy and strong coffee on the table and did not ask him questions, which he appreciated more than he would have been able to explain. There were 2 other boarders. One was a land surveyor named Cornelius Hatch, who was mapping boundaries for a mining company, and who talked constantly about water rights in a way that most people found exhausting, but that Marcus, having once cared deeply about water rights, found intermittently interesting. The other was a widow named Agnes Tolley, who was waiting for her son to send for her, and who spent her evenings knitting and providing quiet commentary on the failings of everyone she had ever known. Marcus ate breakfast with them every morning and learned the rhythms of redemption and began, very slowly, to think about staying. He found work at the livery, because he was good with horses, and because Walt Greer, who owned the livery, had a bad back and appreciated someone who could shoe a horse without being told twice. The work was honest and physical, and it gave Marcus a reason to be in town and a reason to know its people, and he began to know them the way you know people when you work with your hands in a small place, not quickly, but thoroughly. He noticed things about Fiona Prout. He noticed that she was up before anyone else in the house and in bed last, and that she ran the boarding house by herself, because she had run it with her husband for 3 years before he died of a fever, 18 months ago, and that she had not stopped working at the pace of 2 people even though there was now only one of her. He noticed that she was unfailingly kind to Agnes Tolley, even when Agnes was being difficult, and that she laughed easily at genuine absurdity and never at cruelty, and that she had a habit of reading by the lamp after supper with her boots off and her feet tucked up under her, and that she talked to Jeremiah the mule as if he were a person of limited intelligence who she was trying to bring around to reason. He also noticed that she did not need him. This was important. He had met women in difficult circumstances who had needed someone, and there was a trap in that, a hidden motive on both sides that neither person talked about. Fiona Prout had managed her grief and her business and her stubborn mule without his help for 18 months, and she was not looking for rescue. She was looking, if she was looking for anything, for something else entirely. It was that quality, her self-sufficiency, her clarity, that made him fall in love with her in a way that felt different from anything he had experienced before. Not the desperate, urgent feeling of needing to possess something, but the quieter, more permanent feeling of wanting to be in the presence of a particular person for the rest of whatever time he had. He did not know how to say this. He had never been good at saying important things. The skill of his heart and the skill of his tongue were not well acquainted with each other. What he did instead was show up. He fixed the hinge on the back door that had been loose for, by the look of it, several months. He brought Jeremiah his grain ration without being asked. When the surveyor Cornelius Hatch got a summons to Fredericksburg and needed someone to take his rental horse back to the stable, Marcus did it and refused the coin Fiona tried to give him for the trouble. When a traveling merchant tried to sell Fiona a batch of salted pork that Marcus could see had turned, he said so quietly, and the merchant moved on, and Fiona looked at him with the kind of look that meant she had noticed. They had conversations on the porch in the evenings that started as practical things and turned into something else. She told him about her husband, Thomas Prout, who had been a good and gentle man who had died badly, and how grief was not what people told you it was. Not a wave that passed, but a change in the landscape that you simply learned to navigate. He told her about New Mexico in careful pieces, not the betrayal and the hidden motives and the loss, but the land itself. The way the light moved on the red rock hills at evening, the particular silence of a high desert night, the feeling of having built something. "Why did you leave?" she asked one evening, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "It stopped being mine." She looked at him in the way she had when she assessed things, and then nodded as if that were an answer she understood, and did not ask more, and that restraint was another thing he loved about her. He had been in redemption for 4 weeks when the trouble arrived. It arrived in the form of 3 men on good horses, which was the first sign. Men on good horses in redemption were usually selling something or looking for something, and these three had the look of looking. Their names were Burl Tanner, a heavy-set man with a territorial manner, and two men who traveled with him and did not seem to have first names that anyone used. They went to the land office first, and then they went to the Lucky Star, and then they started asking questions around town about land holdings in the surrounding area, specifically about the Prout land. Marcus heard about this from Walt Greer at the livery, who had heard about it from his wife, who had heard about it from Horace Gibbs at the general store, which was the telegraph system of redemption in 1882. Fiona owns 15 acres south of town, Walt said without being asked, because Walt understood that Marcus was now the kind of person who would want to know this. Thomas bought it before he died. Good water access. There is a creek that runs year-round. Mining company has been sniffing around the whole county. Marcus did not say anything, but that evening when he sat on the porch with his coffee, he paid attention to the way Fiona moved and whether she looked worried. She did not look worried. He was not sure if that meant she did not know or if it meant she was the kind of person who did not look worried even when she was. He decided, after some internal debate, to tell her what he had heard. "I know," she said, which startled him. "Burl Tanner. He came to the door this afternoon while you were at the livery. What did he want? He wants to buy the land. He was very polite about it in the way that people are polite when they believe politeness is merely the first stage of a process." She paused. "He made an offer." It was not a terrible offer in terms of money, but the land has a year-round creek, and there is not another one for 6 miles in any direction. If someone controls that water, they control a great deal more than 15 acres. "Are you going to sell?" "No," she said. There was no hesitation in it, no calculation. Just a flat, clear no. Marcus said, "Good," and drank his coffee. Over the following week, Burl Tanner increased his offer twice, and both times Fiona said no. The second time, one of the unnamed men who traveled with Tanner rode past the boarding house at midnight and fired a single shot into the air, which was not illegal but was a clear communication. Marcus had heard the shot. He had come downstairs to find Fiona already in the hallway, holding a shotgun with the steady hands of someone who had been expecting something like this. "I know how to use this," she said, not to him specifically but to the room in general. "I know you do," he said. Agnes Tolley appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown and said, "Is someone dead?" And when they said no, went back to her room. Marcus stayed on the porch for the rest of that night with his rifle across his knees, and in the morning he went to see the county sheriff, a man named Jim Doyle who was conscientious within the limits of what county law could actually accomplish, which were not wide limits. Doyle listened carefully and said, "I can tell Tanner and his men to move along if they step past intimidation into something I can put a law against. What he has done so far is threatening without being chargeable." He paused. "The real problem, Mr. Vane, is that the mining company he works for has a lawyer who is better than the county can afford." "What does she need to do to protect the land?" Marcus asked. "File a homestead improvement affidavit with the county recorder. If she has made improvements on the land in the last 3 years, a fence, a structure, a well, and she can show continuous use, it makes a fraudulent deed claim substantially harder." Doyle paused again, looking at Marcus with the careful look of a man who has spent 20 years reading people. "You have some experience with land law, Mr. Vane." "Some," Marcus said. He did not elaborate, but the experience he had, the bitter, costly experience of watching a fraudulent deed claim succeed, meant he understood exactly what Tanner and his company were likely to try. He understood the particular shape of that betrayal, The hidden motive behind the polite offers, the trap being constructed with legal paperwork while the guns were merely decorative. He told Fiona what Doyle had said. They rode out to her 15 acres together on a Thursday morning, Fiona on a bay mare and Marcus on his weary roan. And he showed her what documentation she would need, and they walked the fence line she had put in 2 years ago, marking the posts that needed repair so that no one could argue the fence had been abandoned. He showed her where to note the seasonal improvements on the county form and what language to use. "How do you know all this?" she asked, as they stood by the creek, which was running clear and cold over smooth rocks, genuinely beautiful water in a dry country. He told her then. About New Mexico and the ranch and Edmund Sloan and the foreman who had been paid to lie. He told it plainly, without bitterness, the way you tell a thing when you have carried it long enough that it has worn smooth. He watched her face as he talked, and she listened with her whole attention in the way she had, not interrupting, not offering early sympathies that would have felt like doors closing on the story before it was done. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment looking at the creek. "That is why you know about water rights," she said. "That is why I know about water rights. And you think Tanner is doing the same thing." "The same shape of thing," he said. "Different details. The principle is the same. Polite offers first, then pressure, then a legal mechanism that looks clean from the outside." She looked at him. "Would you help me file the affidavit?" "Yes," he said, and it came out with more warmth than he had intended, and she heard it and looked away toward the creek for a moment. "I appreciate it," she said. They filed the affidavit the following Monday. Burl Tanner, when he heard about it, and he heard about it because Redemption was a small place with good information circulation, went to the Lucky Star and was apparently very unpleasant to be around for an evening, and then he and his 2 unnamed companions rode out of town on Tuesday morning. The relief in Redemption was palpable and fairly general. Walt Greer bought Marcus a beer, which was the highest expression of gratitude available at the Lucky Star. Cornelius Hatch, who had returned from Fredericksburg and been briefed on events, gave a long and detailed opinion about mineral rights law that no one needed but everyone was too relieved to stop. Agnes Tolley said, "I always knew that man was trouble. You can tell by the horses." That evening, Fiona made a supper that was significantly better than the usual boarding house standard. A beef roast with gravy and biscuits and a dried apple pie that she had been saving the apples for. And when Agnes had gone to her knitting and Cornelius had gone to his maps, Fiona poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across the table from Marcus and looked at him directly. "I need to say something," she said. He waited. "When Thomas died, I decided I was done. With all of it. Not the boarding house or the land or working. I was done with the part of life that involves another person being central to it. I genuinely believed, that the safest thing was to be self-sufficient completely, to not need anything from anyone that I could not provide for myself." She paused. "I have been thinking about whether I still believe that." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a night bird was doing something musical in the darkness. "And," he said. "And I am not sure," she said. "But I think the honest thing to do is to tell you that I have been thinking about it, since you are clearly someone with some interest in the question." He appreciated the directness of this more than he could have said. "I am," he said, "someone with some interest in the question. I need time," she said. "Not because I do not trust you, because I need to trust myself." "All right," he said. "That is it, all right. What else would I say?" She looked at him for a long moment with the assessing expression, and then something in it shifted into something softer. "Most men argue the point. Most men have not had their hearts handed back to them in the form of a signed legal document," he said, "and learn that arguing the point does not help." She laughed at that. A real laugh, genuine and warm, and Marcus Vane thought it was the best sound he had ever heard. He gave her time. He showed up every day to do his work at the livery. He ate his breakfasts at her table. He sat on her porch in the evenings, and he did not push. This required a discipline he had not known he possessed, because the more he knew her, the more certain he was. And certainty was a hard thing to keep still when everything in him wanted to give it somewhere to go. But he kept still, because she had asked him to, and because her reasons were real reasons, not excuses. What happened in those 2 weeks was a kind of gradual deepening that neither of them named directly, but that both of them felt. Conversations that had been careful became less careful. She told him about her family in Virginia, a father who had been kind and a mother who had been complicated, and 2 brothers who were scattered to different parts of a country that was still reconstructing itself from the war. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, a farm family, 3 sisters, a father who had taught him to love work and a mother who had taught him to read, both of them dead of cholera before he was 20. She showed him her kitchen garden, each plant identified, and its purpose explained with the thoroughness of someone who had learned this knowledge through necessity, and then made it a pleasure. He taught her a better way to handle Jeremiah when he was in one of his obstinate moods. Not grain as bribery, but a particular scratch behind the left ear that seemed to reset the mule's entire disposition. "How did you find that?" she said, watching Jeremiah lean into the scratch with an expression of profound contentment. "Trial and error," he said. "Most things worth knowing come from trial and error." She looked at him and smiled, and he felt the smile somewhere in his chest. He bought the ring on a Friday. It was not an impulsive purchase. He had been thinking about it for a week, turning the question over from every angle, examining his own motivations the way he had learned to examine things since New Mexico, making sure he understood what he was doing and why. He was not proposing because he was afraid she would slip away, or because of some social pressure from the small-town environment, or because he wanted the practical benefits of a partner. He was proposing because he woke up every morning, and the first thought in his mind was whether she had slept well, and he wanted to wake up every morning for the rest of his life and be able to ask her. The ring came from a jewelry case at Horace Gibbs' General Store, which also sold tools and dried beans and calico fabric, because redemption was not big enough to have a dedicated jeweler. Gibbs had 3 rings in a small glass case, and the one Marcus chose was a hammered silver band with a chip of blue turquoise, because the color was the same gray blue as Fiona's eyes in morning light, and because the silver was honest, not pretending to be more than it was. He paid $2.30 for it, which was nearly a week's wages. He had a plan. The plan involved asking her on the porch in the evening quietly, privately, after Agnes and Cornelius had retired, so that whatever she said, she could say it without an audience. He had thought about what to say, and while he was not a man of elegant speeches, he had organized his thoughts enough to know what mattered. That he loved her, that he was not asking her to need him but to choose him, that he understood if she was not ready and would not press her. The plan was good. The execution of the plan was catastrophic. So when Fiona walked into the Lucky Star and Marcus, seeing her come through the door, felt all his carefully organized thoughts scatter and reached for the ring out of sheer instinct, the room had already arrived at a state of expectant attention. He called her name. She stopped and looked at him. He came to her. The room was watching. He had meant to say, "I love you. I am not a man who has many gifts to offer, but I would spend my life trying to deserve whatever time you gave me if you were willing to give it." It caught the lantern light. "Would you consider the possibility of that?" Is Fiona Prout, I would very much like to marry you if you thought that was something you might. He heard it before he saw it in her face. The laughter had already started. It rolled through the room like a tide, not cruel exactly, because these were people who knew him and mostly liked him. But it was laughter, unmistakable and definitive. And Fiona's was loudest of all, and the ring had slipped from his fingers in the startled moment of hearing it, and it rolled across the floor and came to rest against the spittoon. He was on one knee. The room was laughing. Fiona had her fingers pressed to her lips and her gray eyes were bright with amusement and something else, something more complicated, but the laugh was the first thing and it landed in him like a stone landing in water, spreading out in rings. He waited for it to stop. He looked at the ring by the spittoon. He felt the choice in the space of a breath. Stand up, recover whatever dignity was available, pretend this had not happened, walk out. Every instinct that had learned about self-protection in New Mexico said stand up. Every piece of him that understood Fiona Prout. The real Fiona Prout, who ran a boarding house alone and argued with a mule and kept secrets about grief, and had told him she was reconsidering whether it was possible to let someone be central, said stay. He put his other knee down. Both knees on the dirty saloon floor, and the laughter died and the room went still, and he said, I know that came out wrong. Most things I say come out wrong, but I meant every single word of it, even the ones in the wrong order. And I will stay right here until you understand that. The silence was enormous. Fiona's hands came down from her lips. The amusement in her eyes was still there, but the complicated thing behind it was larger now, and her face had changed into something that the Lucky Star Saloon had not seen before on the face of Fiona Prout, something open, something without defenses. Marcus, she said. It came out quiet. Not the boarding house voice or the arguing with Tanner voice or even the porch in the evening's voice. A different voice entirely. I love you, he said. I forgot to say that in the speech. That was the main part. I love you, and I am asking if you will marry me. And I know I am on the floor of the Lucky Star Saloon and that is probably not ideal, but here I am. Agnes Tolley, who had come in looking for the whole party of them because supper was getting cold, appeared in the doorway of the saloon, looked at the scene, looked at Fiona and said, Well, it is about time, at a volume that carried impressively. Something broke in Fiona's face. It was not a collapse. It was more like the way ice breaks on a river in spring, not destructive but releasing, the long-held thing letting go. She crossed the floor to him. She picked up the ring herself from near the spittoon, and she held it for a moment, looking at it, at the hammered silver, at the piece of blue turquoise. Then she looked at him, still on both knees, watching her with everything in him visible on his face, nothing protected, nothing held back. Stand up, she said. You do not need to be on the floor. Is that a yes? Stand up, Marcus. He stood up. They were close now, close enough that he could see the lamplight in her eyes and the faint smile at the corner of her mouth and the fact that her hands were not entirely steady. I laughed, she said. I noticed. I am sorry. It was you said the fence law thing and the two names, and it was a mess, he agreed. It was the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me, she said, because you meant every word of it. The fence law part and the horses part and all of it. You were just telling the truth about what you are and what you have and why, and it was the most honest proposal anyone could make. She put the ring in his hand. He understood what she was asking. He took her left hand in his, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her, which it had not been, but some things cooperate with the moment. Is that a yes? He asked again. Yes, she said. It is very much a yes. The Lucky Star Saloon erupted in a noise that started as a cheer and became something more generalized and festive. and Walt Greer told the bartender to open a good bottle. And Cornelius Hatch made a speech that no one listened to because they were all talking. And Agnes Tolley took a glass of whiskey that someone handed her and drank it with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions have been entirely vindicated. Marcus Vane, for the first time in 3 years, felt the particular sensation of having arrived somewhere. The weeks between the proposal and the wedding were busy in the way that small town events generate their own energy, pulling people in and generating tasks and opinions and involvement from every direction. Fiona, who had been managing things herself for so long, found that she was surrounded by offers of help, some of which were genuinely useful, and some of which required careful management. Agnes Tolley, whose son had finally sent for her, and who would be leaving Redemption at the end of the month, threw herself into the wedding preparations with the dedication of someone who had found their final project. She had opinions about the ceremony, the flowers, the food, the appropriate length of the vows, and the general order of events. Most of her opinions were offered in the form of statements rather than suggestions. But Fiona had 3 years of experience handling Agnes and knew how to receive the opinions with grace while making her own decisions. Fiona's younger brother, Daniel Prout, who was farming in Kansas, wrote back to say he could not make the journey in time, which was a quiet disappointment that Fiona accepted without complaint. Her older brother, William, wrote from Georgia to say he was glad she had found someone worth finding, which was more warmth than he usually managed in a letter and made her read it twice. Marcus wrote a letter to his sister Alina in Missouri, who was the only family he had left, and told her he was getting married in Redemption, Texas, and she should know he was happy. The letter she wrote back was full of questions about Fiona that he answered in a second letter with more detail than he normally managed in written words, because he found that writing about Fiona came easily, as if the subject organized him. He kept working at the livery. He also started work on improving the structure that stood on Fiona's 15 acres, a small storage building that had been slowly losing its argument with the weather. He went out on Saturday mornings and worked on it, reinforcing the frame and replacing the roof boards that had given way, and Fiona came out some Saturdays and worked alongside him. Working together in comfortable silence, or in easy conversation, was one of the things he had come to love most, the way it required nothing performed and allowed everything real. One Saturday, while they were eating the lunch Fiona had packed in the shade of the rebuilt structure, she said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "You want to stay in Redemption?" She was looking at the land, the creek visible through the cedar trees, the wide Texas sky above. "Permanently. Not just because this is where I am. I mean, do you want this?" He understood what she was asking, whether this was his choice or a compromise, whether he was building another man's dream or his own. "I would like to expand what you have," he said, "if you were agreeable." The 15 acres could support a small cattle operation. Not a large one, I have learned to be realistic about scale, but something. The creek is the asset. Water and a little land and careful work can build something that lasts. He paused. "I want to build something that lasts. With you." She looked at him with steady gray eyes. "That is what I want to know," she said. "Not the plan, whether you want it." "I want it," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and offered him the last biscuit. The wedding was held on a Sunday in late October, in the little church that also served as a schoolroom, when the worst of the Texas summer heat had broken, and the air had the clear, mild quality of early autumn in the hill country. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Solomon Price, a man of measured speech and genuine warmth, who had been in Redemption since before the drought and had buried Thomas Prout, and who understood what it meant that Fiona was standing here now. Fiona wore a dress that had been her mother's, dark blue wool that she had altered and pressed, and she had put a small spray of dried wildflowers in her hair that Agnes Tolley had prepared and delivered with unexpected tenderness that morning. She looked, Marcus thought when she came through the door, like everything he had not known he was looking for. He had polished his boots and borrowed a coat from Cornelius Hatch, who was taller and broader but whose coat, if not buttoned, achieved a reasonable impression of fit. Walt Greer stood beside him as his witness, a fact that seemed to give Walt genuine pleasure. The vows they had written together on the porch 2 evenings before were simple and honest. Fiona said, "I choose you. Not because I need someone, but because I want you specifically, and that is a better reason." Marcus said, "I will show up, every day in good weather and bad. I am better at showing up than at speeches, and I think showing up is what matters more." Reverend Price said those were among the finest vows he had heard, and there were several people in the pews wiping their eyes, including Agnes Tolley, who was not generally associated with visible emotion. When it was done, when the ring that had rolled across the saloon floor and been picked up by the woman he loved was joined by a matching plain silver band on his own hand, Marcus Vane stood in the door of the church with the October Texas sunlight coming through and Fiona Vane, beside him, and felt, as completely as he had ever felt anything, that he was home. The reception was at the Lucky Star, which had been cleared of its usual furniture, and set up with tables and food contributed by most of the town, because a small town's celebrations are collective projects. There was fiddle music, and there was dancing on the cleared floor, and Walt Greer made a toast that started well and became meandering but ended on the right note. Cornelius Hatch's toast was precise and documented, with reference to the date of Marcus's arrival and the specific legal merits of the homestead affidavit, which was not traditional wedding toast material, but was what Cornelius had. Agnes Tolley, who would leave for her son's home in San Antonio the following Thursday, danced with the Reverend and then with Walt Greer and then sat down and said, with the specific satisfaction of someone who has seen events move in the correct direction, "I told you how it would go. The moment that mule sat down, I knew." "You were not there when the mule sat down," Fiona said. "I was informed," Agnes said with complete dignity. Marcus danced with his wife, which was not a skill he had ever developed, and she guided him through it with patient amusement, and he stepped on her foot twice, and she did not let him apologize too much, and it was, he thought, the best dancing he had ever done. They stayed that first night in the boarding house, because it was Fiona's house and it made sense. And in the morning they had their breakfast table to themselves because Agnes was packing and Cornelius was already at his maps, and they sat across from each other with their coffee in the clear morning light, and it was different from every other morning in a way that did not require naming. A settled, permanent difference, a before and after. "Well," Fiona said. "Well," he agreed. She smiled. He thought again that it was the best sound in the world, that smile, and that he intended to spend considerable time on earning it. It was during those 3 weeks of being ill that he told her the rest of New Mexico. Not just the facts of it that he had told her by the creek, but the interior of it. The way the betrayal had convinced him, for a long time, that building things was a kind of hubris, that whatever you made with your hands could be taken by someone with better paperwork. That love specifically was a trap, because the woman he had loved had chosen security over him and had been, if he was honest, not entirely wrong to do so given what she had known. Fiona sat on the edge of the bed with her hand on his and listened to all of it. "And now," she said. "Now I think the lesson was not that building things is futile," he said. "The lesson was that I was building things alone, and that made them vulnerable. Two people who are genuinely committed to the same thing are harder to defraud than one. That is a very practical romance, she said. I told you I am not good at speeches. She squeezed his hand. I like the practical version, she said. The impractical versions tend to disappoint. He recovered. The winter passed. Spring came to redemption with the particular generosity that follows a hard winter, the cedar and live oak greening up, the creek running full from the hill country rains, the land looking as if it had decided to try again with some enthusiasm. Marcus began building in earnest on the 15 acres. He bought 4 head of cattle to start, because starting small and doing it right was a lesson learned at cost, and he and Fiona spent evenings at the kitchen table working through the accounts with the kind of shared focus that was its own form of intimacy. Fiona turned out to have a clear mathematical mind and no tolerance for optimistic accounting, which meant their projections were realistic in a way that gave them a genuine foundation. He hired a hand named Pedro Salinas, who had been working seasonal jobs around the county, and who knew cattle and whose quiet, careful competence was immediately apparent. Pedro's family had been in Texas when Texas belonged to Mexico, and the injustice of the incremental losses that history had imposed on that claim was something he carried with a dignity that Marcus respected, and that made him more thoughtful about his own relationship to the land he was accumulating. The cattle operation was small, but it grew methodically. By the second spring, they had 12 head. By the third, they had 25 in a proper barn and a second hand. The boarding house continued, because Fiona saw no reason to stop something she was good at, and that served the community, and because the income from it had been the stable foundation during the years when the cattle operation was finding its feet. In the second year of their marriage, Fiona told Marcus over breakfast that she was expecting a child. She told him plainly in the morning light with her coffee cup in her hand, watching his face. He put down his fork. He looked at her. The feeling that moved through him was too large for the room. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you is everything. I am perfectly well," she said. "I have spoken with Mrs. Garcia." Elena Garcia was the midwife in Redemption, a competent and experienced woman who had delivered most of the children born in the county for the past decade. "She says everything is as it should be." He got up from the table and came around and took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at him with the gray eyes that had become the map of his world. "A child," he said, and it came out the way his proposal had, imperfect, insufficient, the word too small for what it was meant to hold. "A child," she confirmed, "arriving, by Mrs. Garcia's estimation, in December." He sat down beside her rather than across from her, which was a rearrangement of their usual breakfast geography that said something neither of them put into words. The pregnancy changed the rhythms of their life without defining them. Fiona was not inclined to be slowed down by her condition, which was her right, and Marcus was not inclined to suggest she should be, which was his wisdom. What he did was quietly take on more of the physical work, wake earlier, manage more of the things she would have managed, in a way that he hoped was helpful rather than smothering. She called him on it anyway, one afternoon in the 3rd month. "I can see what you are doing," she said. "I am doing the fence line check. You have done it twice this week already, and you swept the kitchen. The kitchen needed sweeping. Marcus." She said his name with a particular intonation she had, the one that meant she was going to be very direct and he should pay attention. "I need you to tell me when you are worried. Do not do things around the worry, just tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "I am worried," he said, "about everything, losing you, something going wrong that I cannot fix with a fence post and a survey." He paused. "I have built things before and lost them. I know it can happen." She came to him and put her hand on his jaw, turning his face toward her. "I am not the New Mexico Ranch," she said, "and this is not something that can be taken from you with a fraudulent deed. What we have built is ours, Marcus. All of it, including whatever comes in December." She paused. "But I need you to be here and present, not running fence lines to manage your feelings. I need you to talk to me." "All right," he said. And then, because he had been learning, "I am scared, not of the ordinary things that are risks. Scared of caring this much, because caring this much means there is this much to lose." She looked at him steadily. "That is the truth of loving anything," she said. "I know that better than most people, and I chose it anyway, with you, so do not protect me from it, be in it with me." "All right," he said again. And this time it was a different all right, not the careful, non-committing all right of a drifter managing his exposure, but the full, present all right of someone standing in the middle of what he had chosen. In December, on a cold night with the stars very close in the Texas sky, Fiona delivered a son. The labor was long, and Elena Garcia was there through all of it, capable and calm. And Marcus paced the kitchen floor until Elena put her head out and said he would wear through the boards, and would he please sit down. And he sat down, and then stood up again immediately. Agnes Tolley, who had come back to Redemption for a visit to see how things had gone, sat with him and said nothing, which was the most useful thing she could have done. When the child cried, that first, definitive announcement of an individual in the world, Marcus stood up and his legs were not entirely steady. Elena brought him in. The baby was small and red, and had his mother's dark red hair already, a surprising amount of it, and was expressing strong opinions about the experience of having arrived. Fiona was exhausted and present, and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, which was not something he had expected. He sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the terrified care of a man holding something irreplaceable, and looked down at the small face. "What do we name him?" Fiona said, her voice low and tired and satisfied. They had discussed names. They had not agreed on one. "Thomas," he said. It came out before he had fully made the decision, and he looked at her. "If you want. After a man who was good to you and who deserves to have his name go forward." Fiona looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the baby in his arms. "Thomas William Vane," she said, including her older brother's name with the same instinct, and the naming settled over them both like something decided by someone wiser. Thomas William Vane was, from his first hours, opinionated, loud, and strong. He nursed aggressively, slept with great authority, and regarded the world with the alert expression of someone who intended to have views about it. His father was, to the amusement of the entire town, absolutely undone by him. Marcus Vane, who had been self-contained and careful and measured, became the man who spent 20 minutes talking to a 3-month-old about the qualities of a good fence post, who carried the baby around the kitchen garden at dawn because the baby was awake, and he was awake, and the morning light was good, who could be found at any hour in the rocking chair Cornelius Hatch had sent from Fredericksburg as a gift, talking quietly about cattle and creek water and the general principles of honest work. Fiona watched this and felt something that was beyond what she had words for. The particular fullness of seeing the person you love become something larger than they were. The cattle operation continued to grow. By 1885, 3 years into their marriage, they had 40 head, a hired hand beyond Pedro, and a reputation in the county for honest business that had practical value in the form of good working relationships with neighboring ranches. Marcus had become, without quite planning it, a known and trusted figure in the county, not because he sought that standing, but because standing comes to people who do what they say they will do. He had also, quietly, been watching the land situation in the county, with the attention of someone who understood how these things worked. When a neighboring 40 acres went up for sale, the owner moving east to care for aging parents, he and Fiona discussed it carefully and at length, because it was not a small decision, and they made it together, and they bought it. The additional land meant more water access and more grazing area, and a growth in the operation that was still careful, still within what they could manage and sustain. Pedro Salinas, at the time of this purchase, had been with them for 3 years and had become more than a hand. He was a partner in the daily operation, and his knowledge of the land and its cycles was irreplaceable. Marcus went to him and offered him a formal stake in the operation, a small percentage in exchange for commitment, because it was the right thing, and because it was the smart thing, and because the experience of being betrayed by someone you had trusted had taught him that the way to prevent betrayal was not to trust no one but to treat the people you worked with the honesty and fairness that made betrayal unnecessary. Pedro accepted, and his acceptance had the weight of something mutual and lasting. In 1886, in the spring, Fiona told Marcus over breakfast again. It had become the time for important information, the morning table, the coffee, the clear light, that Thomas was going to have a sibling. Thomas, who was 3.5 and had very strong opinions about the allocation of attention, needed some management around this news. Marcus handled it with considerable skill, the skill of a man who had learned that the way to address a person's fears about being displaced was not to tell them they would not be displaced, but to make the continued reality of their importance continuously evident. He took Thomas with him on the fence line checks. He explained things at length, as if the 3-year-old were a competent but junior partner. Thomas, who had Marcus's seriousness and Fiona's gray eyes and an opinion about everything, took this role extremely seriously and was often observed giving instructions to the cattle. The second child was born in November, a daughter. She arrived with significantly less drama than her brother, a shorter labor, a calm entrance, as if she had assessed the situation in advance and decided efficiency was the appropriate approach. She had dark hair like Marcus and the expression, Elena Garcia said, of someone who had already made several decisions. They named her Clara Elena, the second name for Marcus's sister in Missouri, who had written every month without fail and who had sent, for the occasion, a piece of quilt she had made herself that arrived in perfect condition and was immediately placed in the bassinet. Thomas regarded his sister with the expression of someone whose position has been officially confirmed as senior, but who intends to monitor developments closely. Clara Elena Vane was, from her first weeks, quiet and watchful and determined. Where Thomas expressed himself loudly, Clara expressed herself precisely. Where Thomas charged at problems, Clara circled them. They were, from earliest childhood, completely themselves, which was the best thing that could be said about anyone. The years in redemption built on each other the way good things do, not in leaps but in layers, each one adding to what was underneath. The town itself was growing. The railroad finally arrived in 1887, which changed the economics of everything and brought new people and new businesses, and the particular disruption of growth, which has costs and benefits in equal measure. Marcus watched the changes carefully and adapted what they were doing. The railroad meant a better market for cattle, and it meant more competition, and the combination required the same clear-eyed accounting that Fiona had always enforced at the kitchen table. They had 2 more boarders after Agnes Tolley left, and Cornelius Hatch completed his survey. A schoolteacher named Miss Delaney, who was Redemption's first fully dedicated teacher, as the railroad population growth justified it. a young doctor named Franklin Cross, who had come from Philadelphia and was finding the practical realities of frontier medicine considerably more various than his training had prepared him for. These two were part of the household in the way that boarders become part of a household that is run by someone like Fiona. Present at breakfast, occasionally at supper, included in the small daily life of the house, but not intrusive. Dr. Cross, who was 28 and serious and clearly lonely in the way that transplanted people are lonely, was quietly observed by both Marcus and Fiona to take particular notice of Miss Delaney, who was 25 and precise, and had a laugh that transformed her face. This observation led to a quiet campaign of social engineering by Fiona dinner seating arrangements, small tasks that required cooperation, the provision of good food and firelight at appropriate times, that Marcus supported with amusement and admired for its craft. "You are running an operation," he said one evening. "I am facilitating," she said. "That is the same thing. It is a gentler word." Dr. Cross and Miss Delaney were engaged by the end of 1887, which Fiona received as a personal satisfaction and a professional vindication. They married in the spring of 1888 and moved into the small house Cross had rented near the new clinic, and Fiona's boarding house acquired new residents, and the cycle continued. It was in 1888, 6 years into their marriage, that Marcus got a letter from New Mexico. It was from a lawyer in Santa Fe, not Edmund Sloan's lawyer but a different one, representing a creditor of Sloan's estate. Sloan had died in 1887, apparently of drink, which had been his habit when Marcus had known him, and had apparently remained his habit afterward. His estate was a complicated wreck, with multiple claims against it, and the lawyer was writing because one of the creditors was disputing the original deed claim. And in the course of the legal review, the evidence of fraud had become clear enough that there was a settlement being constructed, and Marcus Vane was owed a portion of it. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Fiona was in the garden. He could see her through the window, talking to Thomas, who was 5 and had decided that the garden was his domain. He brought her the letter. She read it standing in the garden with her hat pushed back. Then she handed it back. "What do you want to do?" she said. "Respond to the lawyer," he said. "Get what is owed, it will go toward the land." "Is that all you feel about it?" He thought about it honestly. "I thought I would feel more," he said. "For a long time I thought I would feel a great deal if justice caught up to Sloan. I thought it was important, but it turns out that by the time it came, I had already built something better than what he took." She looked at him. The assessing expression, the one he had been watching for 6 years, which he now understood was not suspicion but clarity, the way she looked at things to understand them fully. "Yes," she said, "you have." She picked up Thomas, who had been pulling at her skirt, and put him on her hip, and the image of that, Fiona in her garden in the October afternoon with his son on her hip, and the Texas sky above, and the creek running through the cedar trees on their land, was one he put away carefully in the part of himself he kept for things worth keeping. He wrote back to the lawyer. The settlement, when it came, was not enormous. Land values had changed, and the complications of the estate had eaten into it. But it was enough to clear the final outstanding note on the additional 40 acres, which meant they owned the land without encumbrance, which felt like a more significant freedom than the money itself would have. The winter of 1888 was mild and productive. Thomas, who had started at Miss Delaney's school and been assessed as both capable and challenging in equal measure, came home with strong opinions about arithmetic and the injustice of homework. Clara, who was 2, regarded her brother's homework opinions with the expression of someone filing information for later use. On their 6th anniversary, Marcus came home from the cattle pens in the late afternoon to find the kitchen table set better than usual. The lamp lit even though the sun was still in the sky, and Fiona in the dress she had worn on their wedding day, which still fit because she was still herself, just added to. He stopped in the kitchen door. "What is this?" he said. "Anniversary supper," she said. "I thought we were not doing anything formal this year. I changed my mind." He looked at her in the wedding dress, in the lamplight. In the kitchen they had eaten thousands of meals in, and had their best conversations in, and raised 2 children in, and built everything they had built from. He felt the weight of 6 years, and it was not heavy. It was the opposite of heavy. It was the kind of solid, settled fullness that meant he had not been wrong and had not been reckless and had not made the mistake of confusing motion for life. "Fiona," he said. "Sit down," she said. "The biscuits are almost ready and I will not have them get cold." He sat down. She brought the biscuits and then the beef, and then she sat across from him, and the children were at Agnes Tolley's. Agnes visited once a year from San Antonio and made herself useful with a focus that she called grandmothering and that Fiona did not correct. And it was the 2 of them at the table with the lamplight and the smell of good food and the sound of redemption settling into evening outside. "I have been thinking about something," Fiona said. "I can tell," he said. "You have the thinking expression. The thinking expression. You have several expressions. There is the assessing one and the amused one and the quietly outraged one. The thinking one is different. You get very still." She looked at him. "I have been thinking about the Creek land," she said. "The parcel east of ours that Harmon has been trying to sell for a year. If we bought it and used the south section for a proper kitchen garden operation, not just for us but for market, I think there is a real business there, separate from the cattle." He listened. This was one of the gifts of their marriage, that she came to him not with finished plans that needed approval but with ideas that were better for being discussed, and he did the same. They talked through it over supper. The finances, the labor, the market, the risks. He had his concerns and said them, and she addressed some and acknowledged some, and they moved the idea around until it was better than it had started. "We would need to decide by spring," she said. "Then we decide by spring," he said. "I am inclined toward it." "Why?" "Because you are inclined toward it, and you have better agricultural instincts than anyone I have met. And because the East Creek parcel has been underused since Harmon's father died and it deserves better management." He paused. "And because I like building things with you." The last part came out simply, not dressed up, the way important things came out when he was not trying to make a speech. Fiona heard it the way she heard those things, fully, without making a performance of it. "We are good at it," she said. "Building things. We are. Better together than separately. That has been established." She smiled. He still thought it was the best sound in the world. They bought the East Creek parcel in March of 1889. Fiona's kitchen garden operation became, over the following 3 years, a genuine enterprise, selling vegetables and preserved goods to the growing railroad town, to the hotel that had opened in 1889, to the restaurants that came after. She managed it herself, with a woman she hired named Rosa Salinas, who was Pedro's cousin and who had a formidable knowledge of growing things. The cattle operation had reached a sustainable size, not the largest in the county, not straining beyond what they could manage well, but reliable and profitable. Pedro's stake had grown to a true partnership in the day-to-day operations, and his youngest brother had joined as well, and the operation had the quality of something that could outlast any one person, which was, Marcus thought, the point. Thomas started helping with the cattle at 7, with the serious competence of a child who had been talked to about fence posts since infancy and considered himself an authority. Clara, at 5, had appointed herself keeper of the kitchen garden's accounts, which she maintained in a small notebook with the precision of someone who had inherited her mother's mathematical instincts and her father's commitment to record keeping. In 1891, Fiona told Marcus over breakfast, always over breakfast, always in the morning light, that there would be a third child. He looked at her. He was 34 now and she was 33, and they were not, either of them, surprised by this news, and it settled over the breakfast table with the warmth of something right. "When?" he said. "Late summer, Mrs. Garcia thinks. Thomas is going to organize a committee to evaluate this," he said. Fiona laughed. "Clara will manage Thomas. Clara manages everyone." The third child was a boy, born in August heat with the ceiling fans they had installed in 1890 doing their best work. He was a large, calm baby who regarded the world with placid interest and slept with an equanimity his siblings had never managed. They named him Daniel James, Daniel for Fiona's brother in Kansas, who finally managed to visit the following spring and met his nephew with the moved expression of a man who had been away from family too long, and James for no one specifically, but because it was a name that suited him. Daniel James Vane was, from his earliest years, the peacemaker, the child who mediated Thomas and Clara's occasional battles of will with a pragmatic even-handedness that caused his father to look at him sometimes with the expression of a man recognizing something unexpected. The 1890s brought changes to Texas and to redemption that required adjustment. The Great Drought of 1892 hit hard, as droughts in Texas always do, and the careful conservative management of the operation, the year-round creek, the sensibly maintained cattle numbers, the diversified income from the garden enterprise, meant they came through it better than many neighbors, which created both relief and responsibility, because when your neighbors are struggling you are obligated to them. They extended credit to 2 neighboring ranchers. One paid it back in full within a year. The other, an older man named Hobart Crane, who was by then widowed and whose ranch had been declining since before the drought, was not going to be able to repay it, and everyone understood this. Marcus had a private conversation with Hobart one afternoon by the man's fence line, and afterward told Fiona that he had offered Hobart a merger of the properties. Hobart's 50 acres adjacent to their south pasture in exchange for the debt, and a guarantee that Hobart could stay in the house on his land for the remainder of his life, managed and supported. Fiona looked at him for a moment. "That is generous," she said, "and fair." "He built that place over 30 years, Marcus said. "He should not lose it to a dry year, not if we can prevent it." "We have discussed the finances," Fiona said. This was not a question. They had discussed the finances together as they discussed all financial decisions. "We can carry it if we are careful the next 2 years," he said. "Then yes," she said. Hobart Crane accepted, with the particular dignity of a man taking help from someone he respected, and he lived in his house on his land for another 11 years, until his death in 1903, and his company on the neighboring property was not a burden but a benefit. His knowledge of that particular ground, his history with the land's patterns and needs, was worth more than the bookkeeping complication of his presence. Thomas turned 10 in 1893 and had opinions about everything. Clara was 8 and had moved from keeping the garden accounts to improving them, having identified 2 inefficiencies in the record-keeping system that neither parent had noticed. Daniel was 2 and still the peacemaker, though his peacemaking had evolved from simple amiability into actual strategic intervention, which his father found impressive. The schoolteacher, Miss Delaney, who was now Mrs. Cross, had been replaced by a series of less memorable teachers, and then in 1893 by a man named Harold Fitch, who was excellent at teaching mathematics, but had views about certain students that Marcus found in need of correction. The correction was delivered privately, directly, and with the calm firmness of someone who had spent 11 years building a life on the principle that people were owed honesty. Fitch adjusted his approach. Thomas, who had been the subject of the views, was never told about the conversation, because a child's confidence should not be dependent on his father fighting his battles, only on his father ensuring the battles were fair. Marcus turned 40 in 1897. Fiona organized a gathering that she refused to call a party. A gathering, she said, was smaller and more honest. The people who came were the people who had accumulated in their life. Pedro Salinas and his family, Walt Greer, who was moving slower now but still ran the livery, Reverend Price's successor at the church, who had become a friend, Dr. Cross and Aliner, the farmer Daniel Prout, who made the trip from Kansas and stayed a week and left saying he would come more often, meaning it this time. Marcus stood on the porch of the house at the end of that evening, the house they had extended twice now to accommodate the children and the years, and Fiona came to stand beside him, and the Texas night was clear and enormous above the hill country. 40, he said. 40, she confirmed. I did not expect to be 40 with something to show for it, he said. It came out honestly the way things came out with her. That is a very dark thing to say on your birthday, she said. It is a true thing. She put her arm through his. They stood looking at their land, and the star-heavy sky and the lights in the house behind them, where their children were moving around doing whatever children did at the end of a good evening. You walked into redemption on a worn-out horse, she said. With a bedroll and a dark past and a terribly executed mule rescue. The mule rescue worked, debatably. Jeremiah stood up. Jeremiah stood up for your oats, not for you. Do not overstate your role. But she was smiling, and he could hear the smile even without looking at it. You have built something here, Marcus. We have built something. It is real and it is solid and it belongs to us and to our children and to Pedro and to everyone who is part of it. That is 40 years well spent. He covered her hand with his where it rested on his arm. I want to say something, he said. Say it then. I want to say it properly this time, without the fence law and the two names and the ring rolling across the floor. She laughed. Even after 15 years, the story of the proposal was a pleasure to her, which he had come to understand was not about his humiliation but about its honesty, about the fact that he had gone down on both knees on a dirty floor and meant every word of the mess. But he wanted to say the thing he had never quite said cleanly. Fiona, he said. Marcus, she said. You are the best decision I ever made. Not the easiest and not always the simplest, but the best. Everything I have that matters I have because of you. Not because you provided it, because you gave me somewhere solid to build from. You trusted me when trust cost you something, and that is a gift I have never and will never take for granted. She was quiet for a moment. Above them, the stars were doing what Texas stars do in a clear October sky, arranging themselves into something spectacular without effort. That, she said, was a speech. It was, he said. I have been practicing for 15 years. She turned and looked at him fully, the gray eyes in the dark, the face he knew better than any landscape he had ever traveled through, and said, Good. It was worth the practice. And I love you, which I also should say more plainly sometimes. I love you, Marcus Vane, all of you. The fence post speeches, and the both knees on the floor, and the New Mexico, and the careful way you give things enough room to grow. He kissed her, on the porch of their house on their land in Redemption, Texas, at 40 years old with 3 children inside and a creek running through the cedar trees and a sky full of stars. and it was as good as the first time and better for everything it contained. Thomas was 17 in 1900 and had decided, with the certainty of youth, that he was going to study law. His father looked at this from the angle of a man who had watched what good legal knowledge could protect, and said it was an excellent idea. His mother looked at it from the angle of a woman who had watched their eldest argue every point in every discussion since the age of 3, and said it was the most inevitable thing she had ever heard. Clara was 15 and already running her own small accounts within the garden operation, having graduated from record keeper to active manager of the preserved goods enterprise, which she ran with an efficiency that Marcus occasionally found slightly intimidating. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's quiet determination, and her own intelligence, which was considerable and very much hers. Daniel was 9 and going to school and reading everything he could find. He had developed, somewhere in the middle years of his childhood, a deep and serious interest in the natural world, in the plants and animals and water systems of the hill country, that expressed itself in careful notebooks full of observations and drawings. He might be a naturalist, Fiona said, looking at one of the notebooks one evening. In 1900, Marcus said, "What do naturalists do for a living? They observe things. They document them." She paused. "He could teach, or he could work for the government surveys. They are mapping everything now. Or he could run the ranch," Marcus said, "if that is what suits him." "It will not be," Fiona said with certainty. "Thomas will be a lawyer and Clara will run the operation and Daniel will go observe something somewhere." She was right about all three, as it turned out, though those futures were still some years away. The new century came to redemption with the train and the telegraph and the electric light that had reached the largest buildings in town by 1903 and the homes by 1906. The landscape of their life changed in the ways that the times imposed on everyone, the automobile appearing in the county by 1908, which Jeremiah's successor, a considerably more cooperative mule named Ezekiel, regarded with justified suspicion. Jeremiah had died in 1898, of old age, as obstinate in departure as he had been in everything else. Fiona had buried him in the corner of the south pasture with a small marker, which most people in Redemption found eccentric and understandable in equal measure. Thomas left for the University of Texas in Austin in 1901, the first person from Redemption to attend the university, which the town took some collective pride in. He came home summers and wrote letters that were legally precise and full of opinions, exactly as his parents had expected. Clara, at 18, was running the garden and preserved goods operation as its effective manager, with Rosa Salinas as her senior partner and a small staff of her own. She had Marcus's approach to record keeping and Fiona's approach to people, and the result was an operation that had tripled in revenue over 5 years. Marcus watched his daughter and felt the particular pride that is not about having produced someone impressive, but about watching someone be fully themselves. One spring morning in 1905, Clara was 20, Thomas was 22 and had finished his legal studies and opened a practice in Austin. Marcus found Fiona in the kitchen garden in the early light, as he often found her, examining the new growing season's first appearances. He had his coffee and he leaned on the garden gate and watched her for a moment before she heard him. She was 47 now, and the red hair was threaded with silver, and the gray eyes were the same as they had always been, and she was still the most interesting person in any room she entered. She looked up and saw him. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He brought her a cup of coffee, and they stood together in the kitchen garden in the early light, with the creek audible through the trees, and the Texas spring coming up out of the ground in green and yellow. And he thought about the Tuesday in 1882, when he had ridden into Redemption on a tired horse and seen a woman arguing with a mule in the middle of the street. He thought about both knees on the saloon floor. He thought about the affidavit and the winter illness and the ring and the porch evenings and the children and the creek land and the broken fence and the 40 acres and all the years of breakfasts. "What are you thinking?" Fiona said. "About Jeremiah sitting down in the middle of Main Street," he said. She smiled. "My finest hour." "It was, though," he said. "It was the moment when I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were the person I wanted. Someone who would face down a sitting mule with both hands on her hips in complete conviction." He paused. "I did not know yet how to tell you that. I needed another 4 weeks and a disastrous speech and both knees on a dirty floor." "You needed all of that," she agreed. "Worth it," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup with the gray eyes in the morning light, and the smile she had, the real one, the deep one that he had been earning for 23 years, was there, full and unhesitating. "Worth every bit of it," she said. Daniel came home from his studies in 1907, at 16, with a summer's worth of observations about the plants of the hill country, and a plan to continue his studies in the fall that involved a correspondence with a professor at a university in Austin who was doing natural history work. He sat with his parents at the kitchen table and laid out his plan with the careful thoroughness of someone who had been raised in a family where thinking things through was respected. And they listened and asked their questions and supported him entirely. He went on to the university himself in 1910, and his notebooks full of hill country observations became the foundation of a later published work on the native plants of Central Texas that carried the acknowledgement, in its front pages, to his mother, who had first taught him the names of things growing. Thomas married in 1907, a woman from Austin named Helen Marsh, who was a schoolteacher, and who had Thomas's match in intelligence and considerably more patience than he had, which was the correct balance. They had a daughter named Fiona, after her grandmother, who had the red hair and the assessing expression, and was clearly going to be entirely herself. Clara married in 1909, at 26, a man she had known for 3 years named Edmund Price, no relation to the Reverend, who ran the bank in Fredericksburg, and who had the good sense to recognize that being married to Clara meant supporting her work rather than competing with it, which he did with genuine enthusiasm. The ranch continued. The years continued. Marcus and Fiona continued in Redemption, in their house with the blue shutters that had been extended and improved, but was still recognizable as the house he had walked into in 1882, and paid 3 weeks in advance. And the kitchen garden grew, and the cattle operation ran, and the creek ran through the cedar trees, and the Texas sky did what it had always done. There were hard years, a fever in the county in 1902 that took 2 of the families they knew. The drought again in 1909, manageable for them now in ways it had not been in 1892, because the operation was more diversified and the water rights more thoroughly secured. There was a period in 1904 when Marcus was ill again, more seriously than the winter illness of the early marriage, and Fiona nursed him through it with a focused determination that she did not let into her face during the day, but that he heard in the kitchen at night when she thought he was asleep, moving through the house restlessly, unable to be still in the way she could not be still when she was worried. When he recovered fully, he told her he had heard her. "I know you did," she said. "You did not need to pretend you were not worried." "I was not pretending, I was managing." She met his eyes. "There is a difference. Pretending is dishonest. Managing is just not putting the worry on you while you were too sick to bear it." "You could put it on me," he said. "That is what I am here for. You were here to get better," she said, "which you did." She looked at him with the steady gray eyes. "Do not get sick again." "I will do my best," he said. By 1910, Marcus was 53 and Fiona was 52. And Redemption had grown into a genuine small town with a bank and a newspaper and a proper school building, and a sense of established community that only comes to places that have survived enough to earn it. They sat on the porch in the evening still, as they always had. The porch had been rebuilt and expanded, but the two chairs were in the same place, and the habit of evening coffee and conversation had never changed, because there was no reason to change something that was the reliable good thing at the end of every day. One evening in October, with the air clear and cool and the live oaks holding their color, Marcus said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him with the expression he loved, the attending one, the one that meant she was present entirely. He did not get down on his knees this time, because his knees were 53 years old and the porch boards were in better shape than the Lucky Star floor. But the principle of the gesture had already been established, permanently, in the record of who they were. "I want to ask you if you are happy," he said. "Not content, not managing, not satisfied. Happy." She was quiet for a moment, which was not because she was uncertain, but because she was treating the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "I am. This is the life I would choose. All of it. The hard winters and the droughts and the sick years and the children and the work and the porch and the creek and you." She paused. "Are you?" "I rode into this town on a worn-out horse," he said, "with nothing worth keeping except a good work ethic and the ability to make a mule stand up. I have." He looked at their land, the evening light on it, the house behind them, the sound of the creek through the trees. "I have more than I believed was possible for a man like me, and none of it is luck. We built it." "We built it," she said. The stars came out over Redemption, Texas, the way they always did, vast and clear and unhurried. And Fiona and Marcus Vane sat on their porch in the October evening, in the town where a drifter had gotten down on both knees on a dirty saloon floor and meant every word of his clumsy, honest speech. And everything he had built from that moment forward was still standing, solid and real and theirs. The creek ran through the cedar trees in the dark. The cattle moved in the south pasture. Somewhere in the house, a lamp was lit in the room where Daniel had left his notebooks before heading back to Austin, and the careful drawings of the hill country's living things were there, page after page, the long work of a child who had been taught that what was worth seeing was worth documenting. Marcus reached over and took Fiona's hand, and she laced her fingers through his without looking away from the stars. And there was nothing more that needed to be said that had not already been said, most of it imperfectly and all of it meant. The night was long and mild and full of the sounds of a working land at rest, and the two of them sat in it together, as they had sat in 100 evenings before this and would sit in many evenings after, for all the years they had ahead of them, which were enough.